you're just joining, we're inviting you to share your name, organization, and where you're joining from. Wonderful to see people from around the world and lots of different types of organizations. And I think to respect everyone's time and knowing how rich of a discussion we have for you today, we will go ahead and get started. So hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We are so grateful that you are joining us. This session is to mark the launch of the report Beyond Transparency, Building Safe, Accessible Digital Tools for Supply Chain Accountability. My name is Hannah. I am the Director of Stakeholder Engagement at Open Supply Hub. And so let's talk about what we're going to be covering for the next 70-ish minutes together. After we run through some logistics, Open Supply Hub's CEO and Executive Director will be framing the conversation, talking about why this is important in this moment with this particular lens. You'll then hear highlights from the report itself, although we still hope you'll have the opportunity to read the whole thing. There is so much richness that we won't have time to present to you live. And then most importantly, we'll have a panel discussion with labor and civil society leaders discussing some of the key issues and questions raised in the report. And the panel will include a live Q&A where audience members will be able to submit questions and have them answered. And then we'll close. And so a few details for you before we dive into the content. You can turn on live captions at the bottom of your Zoom webinar or Zoom window screen. We are recording this session, and the recording and slides will be shared via email with everyone who registered for the webinar, so you don't have to take notes. If you have questions throughout the session, please do drop them in the Q&A box. And if you need technical support, our team is here to support you in the chat. And shout out to our team members, Jayaram and Francesca, who will be supporting you today. This session will be conducted in English, but if you would like to organize a session on this report for a community or a group you're a part of, or in another language, please do reach out to us. We have a few of those in the works already. And if you haven't already, we continue to invite you to introduce yourself in the chat. Please do feel free to share your name, organization, and where you're joining from. And then before I hand this off to our other speakers, we know that many of you who registered today are meeting Open Supply Hub for the first time. And so I did want to take a moment to share briefly who we are before Natalie shares how and why we came to be publishing this report and hosting this session. So Open Supply Hub is a nonprofit. We are powering the transition to safe and sustainable production with the world's most complete, open, and accessible global supply chain map. A little bit about what's happening behind the scenes there. We are collaboratively built, used, and maintained. And so we're a database showing where global production locations are and who's connected to them. And we aim to make that data easy for anyone to work with. And the goal for that data is to open doors to new solutions, targeted investment, and more effective collaborations. And that comes through bringing diverse sets of stakeholders together through sharing, using, and building on each other's data. And everything we do is built on the belief that transparency is essential for accountability, collaboration, and change. And so we hope that those themes will run through everything today, but that's a little bit about us so you know sort of who the organization is hosting. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Natalie Grillon, who is our CEO, to frame today's conversation.
Thank you, Hannah. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone joining us from around the world. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. Whether this is your first time hearing about Open Supply Hub or you've been a part of our journey for some time, I'm really glad you're here. Your presence reflects a shared belief that transparency and accountability of supply chains aren't abstract ideals, but the foundation of a fair and just global economy. When we founded Open Supply Hub, our name carried a promise: openness in data, in collaboration, and in driving change through shared effort and shared responsibility. That same spirit runs through this report, Beyond Transparency, and it's the first from Open Supply Hub to bring together the perspectives of supply chain workers, trade unions, and civil society organizations from around the world on digital supply chain accountability tools. So why did we publish this now? Well, it's because digital tools, once peripheral, now sit at the center of how we monitor human rights, labor rights, and environmental risks across global supply chains. Laws like the EU's draft Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, or CSDDD, are accelerating this shift, and they're making it clear that companies are expected to know and act on what happens at every tier of their supply chains. This shift is necessary and frankly long overdue, especially for the workers and communities who bear the costs of opaque and unequal globalized supply chains. Now, digital tools are increasingly seen as a pathway to realizing the promise of these new due diligence laws, helping translate regulation into real accountability. But this also raises a crucial question. How can digital tools like Open Supply Hub truly enable this vision? And how can they help actualize the goals of CSDDD rather than just becoming another compliance mechanism? And so it was these questions that led us to this report. Trade unions, grassroots organizations, and civil society groups have always known what's happening on the ground, from the functioning of grievance mechanisms to the realities of freedom of association and everyday working conditions in the farms and factories that produce for global markets. Their knowledge is indispensable, especially at this moment when human rights due diligence laws are reshaping how global supply chains are governed. Now, Open Supply Hub has always endeavored to be a platform that helped connect stakeholders across supply chains, from brands to rights holders and regulators, through shared open data to ultimately bring transformative change. But as we engaged more deeply with that idea, we realized something important. The use cases for industry and regulators were certainly well defined, but the needs, expectations, and priorities of trade unions and worker rights organizations were far less understood. So earlier this year, between May and July, we set out to listen. We spoke with 65 trade unions, worker collectives, and civil society organizations across Asia, the Americas, and Europe, groups that are doing some of the most difficult work in protecting human and environmental rights, and often in challenging and high-risk environments. They gave their time and expertise generously, and we thank them for that. And they shared what it truly takes for digital tools to work for rights holders across very different contexts. They spoke about risks, the fear of retaliation, surveillance, exclusion from decision-making when data is collected or shared without safeguards. They spoke about access, barriers of language, cost, and technology that so often keep those most marginalized from participating. And finally, they spoke about trust, the need for digital tools that are governed transparently, built collaboratively, and grounded in the lived realities of workers and their communities. Across all these conversations, one message came through clearly. The future of supply chain accountability depends on building digital tools that are usable, accessible, and safe for the people most affected by supply chain harms. If we fail to do that, we risk reproducing the very inequalities these tools were meant to dismantle. Looking ahead, we hope to build together with openness, trust, and shared purpose inspired by this report. The insights we've gathered are both a mirror and a map. A mirror reflecting where digital tools are falling short, and a map pointing to what must come next. Our next step at Open Supply Hub is to put these findings into practice, working hand in hand with trade unions, civil society groups, and other partners across the ecosystem to co-design tools that are safer, more inclusive, and grounded in the real-world experiences of workers and their representatives. We know this won't happen overnight. Real change rarely does. Much of what we've heard calls for transformation, not only within Open Supply Hub, but across the entire ecosystem of actors who build, fund, and use digital tools. So as always, this is a core value of Open Supply Hub. That's why we're inviting collaboration today. We are seeking platforms, donors, companies, researchers, right holders, everyone to work with us to test new models of shared governance, to create stronger safeguards for data use, to build meaningful pathways for participation, and ultimately to ensure that transparency truly serves those it most affects. For us, this report is both a reflection and an invitation, a reflection of what we've learned and an invitation to shape what comes next together. We hope it marks a step towards a different kind of supply chain transparency, one that doesn't simply reveal, but rebalances, one that's not only open, but equitable, safe, and shaped by the people whose lives are most intertwined with global supply chains. Because in the end, transparency is not just about seeing clearly, it's about acting justly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Natalie. And we're now going to hear from Nandita, Open Supply Hub Stakeholder Engagement Manager. She is the one who led the consultation and development of the Beyond Transparency report. So she's going to share some highlights from the report for you now.
Thank you, Hannah. I'm very excited to take you through our new report, Beyond Transparency, Building Safe, Accessible Digital Tools for Supply Chain Accountability. In today's presentation, I'll be setting the context, then I'll share briefly our methodology, after which we will look at the findings, what trade unions and civil society organizations told us about the barriers they face in engaging with digital tools. Then I'll highlight the principles for worker-centered design of digital tools that emerge from these conversations. And finally, I'll close with an overview of the key recommendations to help build a safer, more inclusive digital ecosystem for all. Over the last few years, we've seen a surge of digital tools. Most of these are aimed at global supply chains, and they vary from ESG dashboards and AI-based traceability systems to public supplier databases and digital grievance platforms. Driven in part by new due diligence laws like the draft Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive in Europe, these tools have advanced transparency and strengthened advocacy around labor rights and climate justice. And in many ways, they've also become de facto governance mechanisms, shaping sourcing decisions, defining corporate accountability, and influencing whose voices are heard. Yet, despite this progress, many rights holders, especially from the global south, still cannot engage fully or safely with these digital systems. That's where the report Beyond Transparency comes in. The report examines the barriers these groups face and the remedies they themselves propose to make digital tools safe, inclusive, and accountable to everyone. Having heard why we wanted to explore this issue, let me now turn to how we did the study. To ground this report in lived experiences of workers and worker representatives, we reached out to 65 trade unions and civil society organizations and held detailed consultations with them. The consultations were carried out in 8 languages and took place both in person and online. Organizations came from a wide range of countries, including Bangladesh, India, Cambodia, Myanmar, Indonesia, Turkey, Germany, US, UK, among several other regional and global networks. Now let's come to the key barriers to engagement with digital tools that trade unions and civil society organizations shared with us. First, structural constraints. Many participants spoke about working in environments where political repression, surveillance, and the threat of employer retaliation are constant realities. In such contexts, even sharing basic information like the location of a union office or membership numbers can feel unsafe or may even invite retaliation. Just to give one example, in Myanmar, after the coup, over 150 trade unionists have been arrested. 2 were sentenced to life imprisonment, 1 has died in custody, and another one was executed. This is the level of risk some unions face simply for existing. And on top of that, many grassroots unions are chronically underfunded or short-staffed, which makes participation even harder. The second barrier is usability gaps. Participants pointed out that design flaws, language barriers, and unrealistic assumptions about connectivity, literacy, and safety often make a platform technically available but practically inaccessible. To give just one data point, a 2024 GSMA study found that women's mobile internet adoption in India is only 37%. And one trade union in India we spoke to, representing over 15,000 government workers, told us that 95% of their members don't own a laptop, and more than 50% of their members only have a basic model of mobile phone. So most digital tools are almost inaccessible to them. Third, data governance gaps. Unions and CSOs express serious concerns about how their data will be used, especially when they're not represented in the governance structures of the very platforms that collect or publish their data. As one union organizer from South Asia put it, without ownership or decision-making power, we become just data feeders. And finally, some unions and CSOs raise concerns about digital platforms enabling performative accountability or becoming compliance checkboxes rather than spaces of genuine dialogue and remedy. When that happens, they said, these tools risk undermining the very goals that due diligence legislation like the CSDDD are meant to advance. To bring these barriers into sharper focus, here are a few key data highlights from the consultation. About a quarter of the participants cited staffing shortages, limited digital literacy, and lack of core funding to invest in internal digital infrastructure as their main barriers to engaging with digital tools. 22% pointed to restrictive labor laws and state surveillance as major deterrents to contributing data online. 19% feared retaliation from employers or brands, saying that even sharing basic information about grievances or unsafe conditions could lead to factory closures or loss of jobs. And 9% emphasized the importance of language accessibility in these platforms. But participants also spoke about what they would like to be made visible. 65% said that publishing collective bargaining agreements and their text should be a priority, and 72% favored making facility-level grievance information visible, specifically brand, supplier, contact details for each facility, along with key details about the grievance mechanism itself. Having seen the barriers and the data, we now turn to what participants themselves describe as a possible model for building digital initiatives that truly support rights holder participation. These principles shown on the screen are grounded in the lived realities of trade unions and civil society organizations. They are not meant to be a definite checklist, but rather a starting framework that can be adapted and built upon in different contexts. The first principle is trust. Participants emphasize the need for clear, accessible information on how data is collected, used, stored, and governed. Second, safety. Tools must be designed with the above-mentioned risks in mind from the outset. Third, ensuring accessibility to the platform. It means ensuring tools are mobile first, easy to use, available in local languages, because if workers can't access a platform safely and easily, it doesn't serve its purpose. Shared governance and representations of rights holders in decision-making bodies of these digital tools was also brought up as an important principle. And finally, reciprocity. When rights holders contribute knowledge, time, and take personal risks, their contributions must be recognized and valued. Finally, let me share a brief overview of the recommendations from the report. Trade unions and civil society organizations said that for digital supply chain tools to become effective instruments of accountability, they have to evolve from being data repositories into platforms that actively protect, empower, and include the voices of those who have most at stake. And this consultation made it clear that no single actor can do all of this at once. Real progress really depends on coordinated action across the ecosystem. And this report offers targeted recommendations for 4 key stakeholders, those that rights holders themselves identified as having the greatest influence over how these systems are designed, funded, and governed. First, platform developers. Participants emphasize that developers hold immense power in shaping how digital accountability tools are experienced. They call for transparent data governance, clear and accessible systems for consent for data usage, and strong accessibility features. Second, funders. Participants viewed funders as key actors with influence over 2 sides of the ecosystem. On the development side, participants emphasize that funders have a critical role in determining the kind of tools that are getting created and scaled. They urged funders to ensure that projects they support serve rights holder interests, not just corporate or compliance needs emerging from due diligence legislations. At the same time, rights holders stress that meaningful participation requires direct and sustained support to grassroots unions and CSOs themselves through flexible long-term core funding to help overcome the digital divide. They also call for greater investments in digital safety infrastructure, translation, training, so that rights holders can use and engage with these tools safely and confidently. Third, regulators. Participants noted that as digital tools expand alongside human rights due diligence legislation, regulators have a critical role to play. They called for governments and oversight bodies to set clear baseline standards for data ethics and governance of these tools, and to back these with independent oversight to prevent box ticking or tokenistic compliance. And finally, to employers and business actors, participants were clear that digital tools should complement, not replace, direct engagement by companies with workers and their representatives. They stressed that these platforms should be seen as pathways for meaningful stakeholder dialogue, not substitutes for it. This is just a very quick overview. The full report goes into much greater detail. We hope Beyond Transparency serves as a practical pathway for developing digital tools for supply chain accountability and encourages us to think about how these tools can move beyond compliance to enable real access to remedy for workers and their communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nandita. And as a reminder, if anyone who's joining us today has questions about any of the presentations so far, or if you have questions for the panelists in our upcoming section, please do submit them in the Q&A box. And now we are thrilled to bring forward our panel discussion today. And I will hand off to our moderator, Nivedita Jayaram. She's the thematic lead of movement and labor at Women's Fund Asia.
Thank you, Hannah. Hello, everyone. I am very pleased to be moderating today's panel on digital tools for supply chain accountability. And many thanks to Nandita and to the OS Hub team for such a powerful presentation of the Beyond Transparency report. What we've heard is that digital tools for supply chain accountability are becoming more widespread and more sophisticated, including using AI and data platforms. These tools have great potential to improve transparency, empower workers, and help enforce labor rights across global supply chains. But at the same time, the report makes it clear that these tools come with significant risks. If not designed and governed carefully, they can put workers and grassroots groups in vulnerable positions, especially when it comes to data privacy, safety, and meaningful participation. There's also a danger that such tools become just another compliance formality rather than spaces where rights holders can influence decisions that affect them. Today's panel will focus on how we can center rights holders, workers, trade unions, grassroots organizations in the design, governance, and use of digital tools. Our goal is really to explore how to create tools that are safe, that are accessible, and responsive to the needs and realities of those on the ground. I'm really pleased to be joined by three panelists with deep experience working alongside rights holders across regions and sectors. We have with us Shikha Bhattacharjee, who is Head of Research Policy and Innovation at Equidem. She's a lawyer and researcher with over 2 decades of experience collaborating with grassroots organizations and trade unions. Sorry, can you hear me? I don't know if I lost my connection.
We can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, just going back to introducing Shikha. She is a lawyer and researcher with over 2 decades of experience collaborating with grassroots organizations and trade unions across Asia and Africa, focusing on labor rights and corporate accountability. We also have with us Mora, who is the head of program and communication at the Cambodian Alliance of Trade Unions, which is a major federation representing manufacturing workers in Cambodia. Mora has been instrumental in securing improved benefits and protections for workers and actively contributes to regional efforts on living wages and workers' rights. We also have with us Paul Roeland, who is Transparency Lead at the Clean Clothes Campaign and a board member of Open Supply Hub. He brings expertise in open data and digital transparency, advocating for technologies that support worker empowerment and collaborative governance in global garment supply chains. With that, we will come to our discussion. And how we will do this is we'll have some questions for the panelists, and following that, we'll open up for an audience Q&A. My first question is for you, Shikha. So, we are seeing a rise of digital tools, some even using AI, for supply chain management and accountability. These are being used by companies, third parties, and even governments. And the trend has accelerated with the growth of human rights due diligence legislation, such as the draft CS-DDD. How can we ensure that these tools create safe spaces for genuine, meaningful participation by workers, trade unions, and grassroots actors, and prevent them from becoming just another compliance checkbox?
Thank you so much, Nivedita, for always asking hard questions. I want to take us back to where we started with Natalie's presentation and the opening slide where we saw the ecosystem of digital tools, and then we had brands and retailers, suppliers, governing bodies, and workers and their representatives. And I think this slide is instructive because by drawing the ecosystem, it actually prompts us to also ask, what are the relationships of power that govern that ecosystem? And understanding the power dynamics in the ecosystem both clarifies for us what is at stake and what information we need in order to balance power relationships. So I want to start with just a quick suggestion on why a compliance formality is actually extremely risky on supply chains. Because if you tick boxes and you give lead firms and their suppliers grounds to say that they are compliant, when in fact they are not, it actually creates an obstacle for access to justice. If you allow someone to tick the box and say that we are compliant without going under the surface and understanding the experiences of workers, you actually further bury those experiences. So it's not just that it's not enough, but to stop at a compliance tick box actually further undermines and entrenches certain relationships of power. So I'm going to answer the question first, how I think we move from treating data points as compliance metrics to shifting to thinking of them as drivers of change, right? How do we make this shift from ticking the box to using data and compliance to actually shifting power? I'm going to tell you my answer, and then I'm going to justify it. So we need to shift the question we're asking. We need to ask what data empowers workers and ensures fairness for suppliers on global supply chains that are defined by unequal relationships of power in this stage of capitalism. So what do I think that we need to actually have access to? Collective bargaining agreements where they're won. So it demonstrates that it is in fact a possibility and raises the floor of what people can ask for, but also contract data points between brands and suppliers. And why do we need specific contract data points between brands and suppliers? We need to know if suppliers are being paid enough in that contracting relationship to pay living wages and to meet environmental standards. Because if they're not to begin with, given the margins at the stage of contracting to pay people properly for the number of hours they've actually worked, including overtime protection, that's where we see all other rights violations stemming from, I will argue. So what data needs to be open and why? I'll start with that and then move to who needs to have access. So in order to first look quickly at the root of supply chain harms, in a lot of industries, I would venture to say the overwhelming majority, lead firms and suppliers are not vertically integrated in a stable way. So supply chains shift. They shift based on suppliers across geographies, within geographies, underbidding each other. How can we cut our margins in order to still make the product and win this contract? So in industries like the garment industry, we're actually required to look at suppliers are actually required to make their costing open. They have to show to the lead firms, the brands, the fast fashion brands, what are the expenses for fabric, what are the expenses for labor, And then people bid against each other. So where do those costs come from? How do you cut costs? You can only cut so many costs on materials. So what comes in is you cut costs on labor protections and environmental protections. So that is where I would argue is the root of where we see rights violations on supply chains. So what do we need to know? We need access to certain contract terms. So we know if that those contract terms are a foundation for rights respecting workplace practices. And actually here, algorithms could be really interestingly used to assess whether the contract is actually feasible within human rights parameters. So what are the types of contract information I would argue we need? The output requirement or the batch amount, the cost per item for the supplier, subtracting materials costs, what is the lead time, and what is the workforce that is allocated. And if those disclosures are required on contracts while still respecting certain privacy agreements, we can actually determine whether the margins are sufficient to actually advance living wages and the rights that flow from that sort of paradigm. Whether basically hours of work are actually fairly compensated, or if they're not, how are people being driven to do that work? And that's where we see violence enter supply chains, particularly gender-based violence and harassment. Now, this is a complicated argument. I put some links in the chat. The first one is a book where I've worked with some co-authors to really lay out these relationships of power and where we see rights violations stem from them. So then the next question of who needs to have access, in order to leverage power, workers, trade unions, their allies, and regulators need to be able to use this database to challenge non-compliance. So what does that mean in a world of unequal power relationships? Databases need to be economically accessible, not behind a paywall. And they need to be designed with meaningful participation for both worker and state representatives. Because where I think we've really seen inroads in labor rights enforcement is where we have workers' organizations working with the state to hold employers accountable. So here, this is the second link that I've dropped for you, and it's a sort of toolkit on labor standards enforcement that highlights the role of co-enforcement, how formal and sustained joint enforcement efforts between labor standards enforcement agencies and worker centers and workers' organizations can actually advance implementation. So what I'm saying here is that we need data that is accessible in compliance action between workers and the state. And now how do we move towards that? We need to create a situation where workers and state representatives in a tripartite discussion are actually engaged in building the data platforms and deciding what information is relevant for particular labor standards enforcement in particular geographies and locations. The other way that I just wanted to highlight the need for protecting workers, and this comes back to where a point that Nandita made, digital grievance channels need to supplement robust protection for freedom of association. And the reason why that is because the way that all too many of these compliance mechanisms, digital grievance mechanisms are structured is they require individual workers to come forward and make individualized complaints. And that puts that worker at extreme risk. And it also disrupts solidarity because it isolates workers into filing individual grievances. And when you disrupt solidarity, workers actually lack the support often to access these channels. And this gets into the accessibility questions, language accessibility that Nandita mentioned. And so then complaints become individualized and not structural. And when you have an individualized complaint, you can retaliate against the worker, when it's brought forward as a structural issue, a collective issue in the workplace, it requires structural attention. So when we're looking at grievance channels, who needs to have access? I would say collectives need to have access. There need to be spaces for collective complaints. And ultimately, as the point on privacy was made before, when these complaints go forward, it needs to be up to the complainants to decide whether those go public, because that will help their campaign strategy to bring it into the public domain, or whether it needs to be private because the risk of retaliation is so extreme. So we can't have a one-size-fits-all model for the complex geographies and geopolitics of this time. I hope I'm within my time, and I know I went fast also. So I'm happy to answer any questions, and hopefully the links I dropped are helpful.
Thank you, Shikha. Those were excellent insights, and thanks for pointing, very specifically to the unequal power relations in the ecosystem and raising the question of what data really empowers workers, and also the importance of the right to freedom of association, and the need for collective complaints to be able to address issues structurally. I think building on that, and what we've heard from the reports in terms of the opportunities and risks for unions and workers when engaging with digital platforms in repressive or high-risk settings, especially when sharing their own data, my next question is to Mora. So based on your experience, Mora, what opportunities what opportunities do you see, and what are the most overlooked or emerging risks that we should all be paying attention to?
Thank you, Nivedita. It's really important. When we look into the opportunity is, like context of Cambodia, I can say context of Cambodia, but I see this is not just Cambodia, but it's kind of transparency and open data. It's quite difficult, right? For example, like we want to have data from our government or from, it's not an easy because it's close all those data. And then to help data to for our organizing, for our campaign, it's really important that we can use this data to protect and promote the right of the worker at the ground. So, for example, like how Gatu is try to use different in Cambodia to identify to identify one of the target for organizing. For example, I have to go to several different websites to see, to collect all this data, So I think this is how we see that opportunity for us, where the country, where the regulation, the what's called the system is not work for the people, for the workers. So we can use data to targeting to brand, to supplier who are not really comply, who not really improving working condition for the workers. So this is how we are using. But at the same time, we also concerned of our risk as well, because in context of Cambodia, retaliation is really high, how the way of government, how the way of employer who are working together with the government. And so if the data is not really safe, if the engagement from worker is not really safe, this is also our concern, because in that context, we will put ourselves and also our member at risk. So this is that how we can see how it gonna reach. And then I do agree with Shikha, and then with the report from Nivedita as well, that we not just rely on the digital tool, but to having a dialogue, having a discussion between brand and manager to resolve their mechanism. To resolve or to improve their working condition. I think it is also essential. So that I think that it cannot just replace it. It's more just complement, to what is needed for workers. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Mora, for those very grounded insights. My next question is to Paul. Paul, many digital supply chain tools are developed by tech firms or third-party providers who may not have much experience working with unions or grassroots groups, especially those from the global south. From your perspective, what advice would you give digital platform developers to ensure that their tools genuinely serve rights holders?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, but I would emphasize that it takes a model shift and a mind shift. Most of these tools are often financed by brands, by governments, or by donors from the global north. But what they should really think about, the developers, right from the development stage, from the beginning of the development stage, is to see the workers and affected communities as their true customers. Because once you do not see the workers as sort of simple data deliverance, but as customers, we have tools available. You work with personas, you design a number of personas that will use your application. There could be a young mother who has no time because she has to take care of her kids and her mother. There could be a union activist that really wants to share with her co-workers how to use the tools. So you develop 4 or 5 personas. That's very common in app development. You also develop user stories. What does a user want to achieve? How can she or he do that in the most efficient and fun way? You also, when you focus on the workers as the customers, you have to think about the ease of use and about inclusive design. That goes from what devices they can use, the language, use of pictures, anything. All of this is not new, but the crucial mindset is to think of the rights holders as the end customer, not the brand, not the donor, not the MSI. The worker is your customer, and you should do everything to please her or him. So that's the mindset that you should get into. And then you can work a lot more easy with those groups on the ground. But even if that is complicated by language barriers, there are steps you can take. You can use credible representative civil society organizations or unions. You should also think about not developing everything in the global north. It may come as a shock to some people, but there are actually really good digital specialists in the global south, such as Made in Bangladesh, Mapped in Bangladesh, lots of other groups that have experience. So it doesn't have to be developed in the global north. But most of all, you should ask, what is your pitch on why the worker should use your platform? Why should they choose your platform? Try to seduce them, try to think of them as a customer. So what is the benefit for the worker to use your platform? Ideally, of course, that would be concrete improvements, such as a guarantee that your complaint will be handled within 2 weeks or whatever time, but a clearly defined outcome. But there could still be situations where your answer to what is in it for the worker is actually, well, nothing that directly for them. In the end, it mostly benefits the MSI or the brand or the funder or the legislator. If that is truly the case and you cannot get around that, be honest about it. And then you should not only acknowledge the worker for the data that they give, but also compensate them. And I'll make this very simple, pay them. That can be in money for the time that they spent on your tool, or in mobile gigabytes, or in other currency, but it's their time, it's their effort. And that needs to be compensated. These are very poor people. They have other things to do. So if you take them seriously and you don't offer a direct benefit to them from usage of the tool, compensate them. And of course, you should never pay for the desired outcome. So you should never pay according to whether they make a complaint or not, but pay compensation for time and effort. And for repeat data collection, let's say you do a monthly survey on wages or hours, you can even resort to using gamification. Do not be afraid of fun. People like using applications as well, and you should also design it. Fun can be a real motivator as well. You could do like, who has done the most regular updates? There's all kinds of things you could do. That's it for now.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for highlighting both the mindset shift that's required and also giving us such concrete ideas on how the tools can actually benefit workers in their organizations. I'll now turn back to Shikha, and because Shikha, you'd highlighted how we're operating in an ecosystem with unequal power relations. My question is, what are the accountability and governance frameworks, both within digital platforms and from policymakers, that are needed to ensure that these tools actually dismantle rather than replicate existing power imbalances in supply chains?
Audio. Thanks, Nivedita. So you asked kind of two questions there. One is, what accountability mechanisms do we need from platforms? And the other is, what accountability frameworks do we need from policymakers? To begin my answer to the first one, I want to echo Paul that in terms of brands, brand-funded sort of foundations that are feeding into the building of these systems, we are actually looking at a situation where the entities who need a check through these transparency and accountability mechanisms are one designing their own check. And so in some ways, this puts us back in the domain of where we were when we were looking at unenforceable business and human rights commitments, where you could put up that you have business and human rights commitments under the Ruggie principles with actually no enforcement mandate. So I think the first thing we really need to do is very rigorously raise the threshold of what platforms and what data is considered legitimate. And I think that we need to be very open and say that unless we have worker and state input that ensures that the structure of the platform is transparent and accountable, that we may actually be looking at data that is moving in the direction of masking rather than exposing rights violations. So we have a responsibility to begin with as an ecosystem for really questioning whose data we'll take seriously. How do we get there? What accountability frameworks do we need from policymakers? In some ways, this is a more complicated question, and it's a question where when we think of what can we do now and what can we build towards over time, the scenario that we're in right now actually is that digital platforms are particularly poorly regulated, and especially where algorithms are a core part of that platform, and they may be protected by IP law, by trade secrets, by international trade law. And what we end up with then is algorithmic bias. And when we have commercial platforms who are choosing how the algorithms show particular users particular data, we're actually feeding into an ecosystem of potential greenwashing, potential redwashing, and this is really what's at risk. So the third link that I put in the chat before is an article that I worked on in the Jacobin, actually with Nandita, about how algorithms really are not neutral and the types of control they have over consumer markets and also workers. So what do we need to do to get algorithmic accountability? And this goes back to the question that I raised of how do we establish a threshold of what type of data we consider legitimate? And so ideally, we need to build towards publicly accountable digital ethics bodies or ombudspersons that actually have regulatory authority to review how platforms handle worker data, how they collect that data to begin with. So for instance, this goes back again to Paul's point. If the AI is using audit data that was collected during a supplier firm audit where the supplier knew beforehand when the auditors were coming and they present a particular face, and then that's considered legitimate data to feed into an algorithmic system that then tells you whether or not that supplier is compliant. What we actually have there is an exercise in masking rights violations. So what we need to demand is, and so I said it'll take us a while to get to accountable digital ombudspersons, to get into the regulatory black box of even regulating algorithms to begin with. This is where we're trying to go. But where we are right now, we need to really ask the question, how is this data collected? How is it being algorithmically reconfigured? And what does that do to the legitimacy of that data? And so we need to be evaluating platforms, see where they're pulling their data from, see how legitimate they actually are. Ultimately, we want to get to a point where AI and algorithmic systems used in human rights due diligence must undergo human rights due diligence impacts assessments themselves. Now, we are not there, but for now, we can be vigilant and we can start making the arguments and calling out the importance between having reliably sourced information as our foundation for aggregated and algorithmically managed data. So how can we do that right now? We can push platforms themselves to disclose their terms of use, their data governance, their risk assessment practices, their data sources. When someone gets a database query, they can be told what data sources went into that. Like, is that supplier location that was accessible on, say, Open Supply Hub, was that drawn from an H&M factory list that was released? And on what date was it released? And how was that data clean? Were each of those data points independently verified? Were each of those supplier factories checked? Was it checked whether that supplier factory is in fact one supplier factory or a tier 1 with 3 subsidiaries? These are the questions we really need to know about not only how data is collected, but how it's triangulated and how it's verified. And then my last answer kind of goes back to what I was saying before, is we need to treat worker data rights extremely seriously. And so if we're the people who build platforms and run platforms, before you put something out on a platform that comes from a worker organization, there needs to be a release form. And then whether that information goes forward, aggregated or disaggregated from identifying information, that also needs to be something that someone affirmatively assents to. If you're going to file my grievance, does it have my name and does it have my unit number? Or do I, like, what level of distance do I need from my data to feel secure? So again, hard question, very hard area of work. We have to get to a place where we're regulating digital platforms. Then we need to define the types of regulations that will actually protect worker interests. But for now, we need to be hypervigilant about what data is used, and especially call out audit data as a source of information if it's not an independent auditor that's tied to a state regulatory body as part of the inspections. And even then, when Labor Department officials show up, often supplier factories, no.
Thanks, Shikha. Really appreciate that, especially, the interesting parallel to how we might be falling back to unenforceable, business and human rights commitments unless we ask some of these tough questions. I will now move to Paul. Paul, in practice, digital platforms face trade-offs. For example, between openness and confidentiality, or between centralized systems, which may be efficient but risk concentrating power, and decentralized models, which offer local ownership but less consistency. How should tech platforms navigate these trade-offs, and what approaches can ensure that they're resolved in ways that protect rights holders?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think the separation in the question between, let's say, global infrastructure and localized infrastructure is a bit of a false dichotomy. It can be a false separation. because a decentralized model with local ownership can actually be more risky. It can be subject to state intervention, where if it's localized, that means also the local government can come in and impound it. But there can also be issues with bad security practice, loss of information, hacking. A very localized system can also be completely eradicated if there is a climate emergency, if there is a flooding, and the data is only available local, it's gone. So, and also localized projects can have issues with their longevity if crucial staff members move on. And relying on global tech, on the other hand, does not have to mean concentrating the power. You can work with global infrastructure if you think good and well and long about the security model, the governance, and the stewardship design. So I would say that it's not necessarily a choice between localized and more global, using more global infrastructure. It's a question of first starting off with a proper risk analysis. What are the exact risks with storing each data point? What are the attack vectors? Do you actually need all the data points? Or why would you even store a name? You can store hashes, you can store codes. You need to think about that. And also you need to think about what are the levels of access. Do all the participants get access to all data points? Probably not. So you really need to define that and do that risk analysis. And the key principles here are also, they're not something that we have to reinvent. People have thought about this for a long, long time. I recommend looking up the responsible data stewardship study by the Open Data Institute. Also, there a lot of work already has been done on inclusive design principles, and there's also a lot of experience in using open data. Because yeah, the one thing that I also really want to stress, like, do not reinvent wheels, but build on the work others have already done. Trust me, I have seen factories where there were 3 different apps in place for worker voice, going to different brands. No worker is helped if she has to choose between 3 applications to file a complaint, because she has no clue which one will be quicker, easier, or lead to the desired remedy. So there must be cooperation. Otherwise, there will be a flood of useless digital tools that will all flop. And there is an increasing ecosystem to standardize on things like terms to be used. There's a lot of work, for instance, being done on the UN Transparency Protocol, which defines lots of ways of how different ecosystems can interact with different access levels without it all ending up in one giant database. It's more like, how can different data systems talk to each other in a standardized way. And I think that my most important recommendation that I always give to every tool maker is you need to do what I call the Black Mirror analysis. I don't know if everybody is familiar with the science fiction series Black Mirror. It's a British TV dystopian science fiction series where basically you take any piece of technology and you think of the most evil way that could be used. Think of yourself as a scenario writer for Black Mirror and think about what would happen with the data that I collect in the worst case scenario. I'll give a very concrete example. There may be very good reasons why people thought it would be a great idea to collect the percentage of undocumented migrants in garment factories. If you disclose that data on Los Angeles garment factories today, I can guarantee you that is an extremely bad idea, because ICE will be running down these factories. So that is my Black Mirror analysis. Things can go horribly wrong if you haven't thought about the security model. So that, yeah, do the responsible data stewardships that is iterative, systematic, must be public benefit, do no harm, and redress structural inequalities. Actually, they match quite well with the report that Open Supply Hub is releasing today. So that pleases me that independent thinkers and researchers come to the same conclusion. So we don't have to start from scratch. But yeah, we have to be careful, but it's doable. Thanks.
Thanks, Paul. And my final question is to Mora. Mora, from your perspective, what would make grassroots unions and worker organizations feel safe, respected, and empowered to engage with digital supply chain accountability tools? And what advice would you give the wider ecosystem of actors, whether it be platform developers, brands, donors, or policymakers, to help make that possible?
Well, actually, to make it more meaningful, actually, cannot just like we having a data, but we need a fully kind of engagement. When I say engagement, just cannot just kind of a training, and then expect that for example, like a training, and you invite union, you invite worker to take part, and then you expect that okay, this is engagement, and then it can work. It's not gonna work in that way. It's really important to support them, to support the union, to get them to practice, to learn. As we go back to how Nandita presentation, there's some of the gap, for example, like in terms of digital capacity, knowledge on that, and then also how they are practice, they doing, from day to day, to experience that, to know that, so I think this is very important. And then like my experience as well, you might be heard about BSC, Better Factory program in Cambodia, where they make also data report as well. But how many union, how many workers was aware of that? How many was engaged with that? They don't know. They don't really take part of that. But lately, got two initiative project, and then we get our member try to use it, try to access to it, and then we see there's something there, how worker can use this data to talk with their manager to improve their working condition. So this is we can see how it make a change, and then how it's more meaningful, for the workers, for the union as well. So fund them, support them. I think this is very important, and then make a tool more simply and accessible for the worker. I think it's also very, very important. And then I can see not many union, not many worker like in Cambodia, access to different data, because of the capacity, because of the knowledge of them as well. So yeah, so I think this is how can make it more wider and more useful. I think it is really important. Yeah. Yeah, there's more data, there's more transparency to show the commitment and accountability of those big company or those supplier. I think this is essential, it is important. But like I said, it is also need a meaningful participation or engagement, how worker able to use it, know how to use it, So I think this is also very important. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Mora, and thanks to all of the panelists, for their very valuable contributions, especially answering such tough and such dense questions. I will now open up the floor for question and answer from our audience. I think some of the questions have already been dropped in the chat. So I'll just wait for someone from OS Hub to share those questions with me.
Nivedita, I shared that with you via chat.
Okay, thanks, Jayaram. The first question that we have is, which any of the panelists can take, is what is your take on the role of certifications within the topic of supply chain digital tools and accountability?
I am afraid that I would have a rather critical view of many of the certifications. There are a lot of certifications that are literally tick boxing exercises, and there are only very few that do true meaningful stakeholder engagements and look at in a holistic way at both social and climate and ecological harm in supply chain. So most focus only on one issue, and basically, well, by the very design, it's a tick boxing exercise. You either get the certification or you don't. So yeah, I have a rather critical view on that.
Thanks, Paul. Would you like to add something, Shikha or Mora? Or I can move on to the next question.
Nivedita, I would say that we could go back to Paul's Black Mirror test with certifications and who is certifying what. And if you have the power to certify someone, what does that actually give you? It gives you the power to excuse them from further scrutiny. So I think we see the same risks embedded in these certification systems that actually move us forward with this compliance tick box that I hope I'm helping to contribute to the narrative of these being extremely dangerous. It's not neutral, it's not benign, but a certification that is not rigorous is actually damaging.
For me, I'm not really experienced with this. I heard about that, and I know there's some kind of monitoring all these thing assessment, but yeah, I still question in terms of how it's neutrality, and then how, you know, because it's more mostly you know, how it's open and transparency into that process. Even in context of Cambodia, for example, like I said, in terms of better work program, ILO better work program is still questionable, you know. So yeah, yeah.
Thank you everyone. The next question that we have is, can you elaborate on how rights holders will be included in shared governance structures? What decision-making power will they actually hold? I think this has been partially answered by all of you, but if if you have any additional points to add.
No, I don't have anything to add there.
Sorry, if nothing more to add, then maybe I can move on to the next question. And if you have something you want to add later on, you can do that. The next question is, have any workers' organizations or unions or small collections of workers ever considered boycotting the private sector worker voice apps that are commodifying their data?
I am not aware of open boycotts. There are, of course, silent boycotts, people simply not using them because they're not fit for purpose. I don't think in my knowledge, there hasn't been an open public, let's say, political boycotts, but we do know of very many cases where workers were simply saying like, yeah, this is something that we're obviously not going to use. So it goes mostly on that level where workers are sort of like, yeah, they hang this thing there. We tried it once, nobody answered. Yeah, not helpful.
So Nivedita, couple of things. I think some of the first worker voice apps were coming into the market around 2011, 2012. And what I found to be at that time really instructive, but the same sort of critiques right now about individualizing complaints, splintering collective and structural complaints, and how that ends up working through this ecosystem was something that the trade union movement in India, at least, was calling out for quite some time. And so I think there was a recognition from workers and unions that these were not helpful, that they were not actually complementary channels for grievances, but that displaced worker representation and siloed complaints. The other thing is that TTCU did actually boycott using these apps. So we not only have a genuine decade-old critique of these grievance mechanisms from the trade union movement, but we also have local women's-led organizations and trade unions taking it up and pushing them out of their workplace. So I think that this is actually loops back to the first answer that I gave, that none of the sort of worker voice apps I've seen for the last decade have actually had meaningful engagement with workers in designing them. And so these critiques that we can make 10 years later were actually critiques that were made immediately from the factory floor, which is exactly why we need meaningful input from workers, their organizations, and state regulators about what is helpful and what is not.
I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll close the Q&A.
All right, we have one final question, which is, can you say more about engagement with the state in terms of design of platforms, given that states are often involved in repression against workers or communities? How to make the case to state representatives that they should support platforms that better support workers' rights? Please go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, I do think experience has shown that in many, at least in the garment industry, many producer states have, let's say, less than fully democratic governments. That is, of course, not by accident. That is exactly why the supply chains move there. So the more successful mechanisms that we have seen usually have shared responsibility, for instance, being chaired by the ILO, with formal trade union representation, ideally from international trade unions who are less susceptible to pressure from an individual government. So in most cases, it needs, let's say, a wider framework on governance than just a local government. Of course, yeah, we've seen extreme examples in Myanmar after the coup. There is no way you can do meaningful due diligence in Myanmar at this moment. So there is also no way you could trust data coming out of that government. So there needs to be some kind of international oversight with worker rights participation, and the most practical form of that is usually with ILO chairpersonship and at least equal participation by trade unions, and often also by signatory membership of civil society organizations.
Thank you, Paul. Shikha?
Yeah, I'll just add 2 points actually, building from where you left off, Paul. I agree with you 100% that we really need to look at the interaction between supply chains and local structures and whether they are actually exploitative structures or potentially can be used in regulation. And so I think that just operationalizing that in 2 parts, we need data source disclosure when information is given. So if we have information, for instance, coming from a repressive state that may be concealing labor rights conditions, the source of that data should be very clear to someone who may want to use it in determining whether or not that supply chain is in fact free of different types of labor rights abuses. The other thing that this points to is that part of the argument that I'm making here is that we have to have reliable data sources. So we need data from workers and their organizations, and we need to really have a way of exposing and aggregating rights violations across supply chains. And at the same time, in light of this question, that poses extreme risk, which is why when someone uploads data to a portal, they should be able to determine the security of the data, what their privacy protections are, and they have to have the ability to change that. And here again, I just want to underscore Paul's example of it may be strategic at one stage to name in LA what percentage of your workers are migrant workers in a particular factory. And then over time that shifts. And so not only do we need to have privacy protections, but we have to have privacy protections that are iterative and allow organizations to come in and say, we put that data out, we don't want it out anymore. Or we put that data out, initially we wanted to show the strength of our union, please remove it. And with that, then the history of that data also has to be erased. And so these, I think, are very important measures and steps we need to think about.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thanks to our panelists and many thanks to our audience as well for the excellent engagement. I think our discussion today and the insights from the report really reinforced for us that freedom of association and collective bargaining are central to achieving any kind of meaningful accountability in supply chains. And digital tools can support this process, but they cannot replace worker organizing. For these tools to be effective, they must be built with and for the participation of workers and their representatives, not simply imposed or designed in isolation. We've also heard clearly that in high-risk repressive environments, data security and privacy are not abstract concerns. They're very fundamental to safety. Tools must be designed with strong safeguards and limitations on how data is used and shared, especially considering the real risks that workers face when speaking out. We've also heard about regulatory frameworks and how they play an important role, especially in how they should be shaped carefully in the context where digital mechanisms are enabled or incentivized without adequate oversight or alignment with local legal systems, how they might risk bypassing national protections or disempowering the very people that they claim to serve. Looking really at how laws must be informed by those on the front lines and must reinforce, not undermine existing accountability systems and forms of organization. A critical area that was highlighted was also funding, and this also came out a lot when talking about accessibility. Too often worker organizations are expected to participate without the resources required to do so safely and meaningfully. So looking at resourcing and flowing funds directly to grassroots worker organizations to be able to strengthen their leadership, build long-term organizational capacities, and ensure that they can securely engage on their own terms, and making this part of a commitment to a larger movement building process by not funding just projects, but investing in the power and sustainability of frontline worker movements, whose leadership is essential ultimately to shaping and sustaining accountability. Thank you all for being part of this conversation. I am going to hand over to the OS Hub team now for the final reflections.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for the fantastic questions. Thank you to the panelists for the incredibly rich discussion. I want to acknowledge that there were some questions about Open Supply Hub, specifically how we work now, how we're taking some of this feedback that we received in the report and this continued discussion into account. We specifically did not make this presentation today about us. We didn't want to sit on the results of the consultation until we were ready with our full plan, but just to say, rest assured that we have some short-term commitments and changes that we're making that we'll share about sooner, and some longer-term discussions in the works. So your patience as we get ready to share those with you. But in the meantime, I'll close today with an invitation. We know we are by no means the first or the only organization asking questions or doing work like this. And we do, to the point Paul made during the panel, want to collaborate and partner as much as possible. And so if you haven't read the report yet, we've put the link in the chat. We'll put it in again, and we'll share it in our follow-up email as well to all of you. We hope that if this work is resonating and you see an opportunity to work together on any elements of it, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We would love to hear from you. Our email address is on the screen. It's on our website. And you will hear from us soon with a recording and related resources via email. And just thank you again to everyone who joined, presented, or supported today's sessions. We wish you well in the rest of your morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much.